The sun was setting over Ashford, Kentucky, when Sarah Miller stood on the sidewalk holding her 9-month-old daughter, watching two men carry her belongings out of the small apartment she'd called home for 3 years. The eviction notice had come without warning. A mistake in the rental office, they said, but the damage was done. Her savings account was empty after paying for her daughter's medical treatments, and now she had nowhere to go. The property manager, Carl Dreyfus, stood with his arms crossed, smirking as he watched her cry. He'd always hated single mothers in his building. What he didn't know was that Sarah's late husband, Daniel Miller, had served 2 tours in Iraq with a man named Marcus Reaper Holt, a bond forged in blood and fire, sealed with a promise that was never forgotten. When Marcus received the call from a neighbor who recognized Sarah from Daniel's funeral photo, he didn't hesitate. He made 3 phone calls. Within an hour, the word had spread through 7 counties, from Louisville to Lexington, from Cincinnati to Nashville. By the time the sun began to dip behind the hills, 120 motorcycles were rolling toward a quiet street in Ashford, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. They came from motorcycle clubs, veteran groups, fire stations and highways, men and women who understood that a promise to a fallen brother was eternal. What started as an eviction would become a reckoning, and by sunrise Carl Dreyfus would learn that some debts can never be erased, and some families are built not by blood, but by loyalty that refuses to die. The late afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows of the 3rd-floor apartment as Sarah Miller folded her daughter's clothes into a cardboard box. Her hands trembled. Outside, she could hear the heavy footsteps of the movers Carl Dreyfus had hired, 2 men who didn't ask questions and didn't care about the answers. "Mum, we need you to step outside now," one of them said from the doorway. He was young, maybe 25, with a face that suggested he'd done this kind of work before. His partner stood behind him, silent and broad-shouldered. Sarah looked down at Emma, who was sitting on a blanket near the window, chewing on a stuffed rabbit. 9 months old, too young to understand that the only home she'd ever known was being taken away. "I just need another week," Sarah said quietly. "I have the money coming. My insurance reimbursement." "Not our problem," the younger man interrupted. "Mr. Dreyfus gave us a job. We're just doing it." She wanted to argue. She wanted to scream. But she'd learned over the past year that the world didn't care about fairness. It cared about paperwork and deadlines, and men like Carl Dreyfus who enjoyed watching people suffer. She picked up Emma and walked down the narrow staircase, each step heavier than the last. Outside, a small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. Neighbors who whispered and pointed, but didn't offer help. Carl Dreyfus stood near his black SUV, arms crossed, a faint smile on his lips. "Should have paid on time, Mrs. Miller," he said as she passed. "This is what happens when you can't keep up." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat was too tight, her chest too heavy. She sat down on the curb and held Emma close, watching as her furniture was carried out piece by piece. The crib Daniel had assembled the night before he deployed, the kitchen table where they'd shared their last meal together, the photographs she hadn't had time to pack. If you're watching, please take a moment to comment where you're watching from. Your support means everything. An older woman from the apartment next door approached cautiously. Her name was Margaret, a widow in her 70s who had lived in the building longer than anyone else. "I'm so sorry, dear," Margaret said softly. She knelt down beside Sarah. "I called someone. Someone your husband knew." Sarah looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" "Daniel showed me a photograph once," Margaret continued. "A group of men in desert uniforms. He pointed to one of them and said, 'If anything ever happens to me, this man will take care of my family.' I found that photograph in a box you left in the hallway last month. I recognized you in it. So I called him." "You called who?" "Marcus Holt," Margaret said. "He answered on the second ring." Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't heard that name in over a year, not since Daniel's funeral, when a tall man with graying hair and a scarred face had knelt beside her and whispered, "If you ever need anything, you call me. day or night. That's a promise. She'd been too numb with grief to remember, too lost to believe anyone would actually keep such a promise. "What did he say?" Sarah asked. Margaret smiled faintly. He said, "I'm on my way." Marcus Reaper Holt was sitting on the porch of his farmhouse outside Louisville when his phone rang. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. He'd spent the afternoon working on his motorcycle, a 1998 Harley Road King that had carried him through more miles than he cared to count. He didn't recognize the number, but he answered anyway. In his line of work, or what remained of it, unknown numbers often meant someone was in trouble. "This is Marcus." "Mr. Holt," the voice was elderly, cautious. "My name is Margaret Kinsley. I live in Ashford, Kentucky. I'm calling about Sarah Miller." Marcus sat up straight. He remembered Sarah, the young woman with red-rimmed eyes who'd stood beside Daniel's casket, holding a baby that would never know her father. He'd made a promise that day, the kind of promise you don't make lightly. "What happened?" he asked. Margaret explained quickly, the eviction, the property manager, the lack of options. Marcus listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with each detail. "Where is she now?" he asked when Margaret finished. "Sitting on the sidewalk outside the building. She has nowhere to go." Marcus stood and walked into the house. "Tell her I'm coming, and tell her she's not alone." He hung up and stared at the photograph on the mantel. 6 men in desert camouflage, standing in front of a Humvee in Fallujah. Daniel Miller was second from the left, grinning despite the heat and the danger. Marcus was beside him, younger then, before the scars and the grey hair. He pulled out his phone and opened a group chat labeled Brotherhood. It had been months since anyone had posted, but he knew they were all still there, watching, waiting for a reason to ride again. He typed quickly, "Brothers, I need you. Ashford, Kentucky, sunset. A widow and her daughter are being thrown into the street. Daniel Miller's family. We ride for him." The responses came within seconds. "On my way. Jackson Priest Cole, Nashville. Lexington's rolling. Thomas Chainsaw Grant. Count me in. Victor, Nomad, Reyes, Cincinnati." The messages multiplied. Marcus watched as the number climbed. 10, 20, 50. He made 2 more calls. One to a fire chief in Louisville who owed him a favor, another to a nurse who ran a veterans shelter in Covington. By the time he finished, 120 people had confirmed. Motorcycles, trucks, vans. They were coming from 7 counties, converging on a quiet street in Ashford, where a young mother sat on the curb with her daughter, unaware that an army was riding toward her. Marcus grabbed his leather jacket and walked outside. The Harley roared to life beneath him, the sound echoing across the empty fields like a war drum. He had a promise to keep. The first motorcycle arrived just after 6 o'clock, when the sky had turned the color of old copper. Sarah was still sitting on the curb, Emma asleep against her shoulder, when she heard the low rumble of an engine approaching from the east. She looked up and saw a single rider, a man in his 50s with graying hair pulled back into a ponytail, wearing a leather vest covered in patches. He stopped in front of her and killed the engine. "Sarah Miller?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Marcus sent me ahead," the man said. He removed his sunglasses, revealing kind eyes. "My name's Jackson Cole. People call me Priest. Marcus is 10 minutes out. So are about 100 others." 100? Sarah repeated, not understanding. Jackson smiled. "Your husband saved Marcus's life in Fallujah. Marcus doesn't forget. None of us do." Before Sarah could respond, she heard it, a sound like distant thunder, growing louder by the second. She turned toward the main road and saw them. "We're now in Ashford, Kentucky. Sunset on a Sunday evening, October 19th, 2025. They came in formation, rows of motorcycles stretching back as far as she could see, their headlights cutting through the dusk like stars falling to earth. The roar of their engines shook the windows of the apartment building. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches, mouths open in shock. Carl Dreyfus emerged from his SUV, his face pale. The motorcycles filled the street, lining both sides, their riders dismounting in silence. Men and women, some young, some old, all wearing leather vests marked with symbols of service and sacrifice. Veterans, firefighters, nurses, truck drivers, people who understood what it meant to keep a promise. Marcus Holt pulled up last, his Harley gleaming under the streetlights. He dismounted slowly and walked toward Sarah. She stood, still holding Emma, tears streaming down her face. "You called," she whispered. "I promised," Marcus said simply. He turned to face Carl Dreyfus, who was now standing frozen near his SUV, surrounded by 120 people who stared at him in silence. "Mr. Dreyfus," Marcus called out, his voice calm but carrying the weight of iron. "We need to talk about your decision today, and we need to talk about what happens next." Carl's hands trembled. He looked at the crowd, then at Sarah, then back at Marcus. This is private property," Carl stammered. "You can't—" "We're not here to break the law," Marcus interrupted. "We're here to make sure you understand something. This woman's husband died serving his country. He left behind a family, and you threw them into the street." The crowd remained silent, but their presence spoke louder than any words. "So here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued. "You're going to reverse this eviction. You're going to apologize. And you're going to make sure Sarah and her daughter have a place to live until she's back on her feet. If you don't, every single person here is going to make it their personal mission to ensure everyone in this town knows exactly what kind of man you are." Carl opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the crowd again, at the veterans with their folded arms, at the firefighters with their steady gazes, at the women holding signs that read, "Justice for Sarah." He had no choice. Carl Dreyfus stood near his SUV, his face flushed red, his hands clenched into fists. He was used to people backing down, tenants who couldn't afford legal battles, single mothers with nowhere else to go, the powerless and the desperate. But he wasn't prepared for this. Marcus stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. Behind him, the 120 riders remained silent, a wall of leather and steel and unwavering resolve. "I'm giving you a choice," Marcus said quietly. "You can do the right thing now, or we can make this very public. Every news station within 100 miles will hear about how you evicted a widow and her infant daughter. Every social media page will share her story. Every veterans group in Kentucky will know your name." Carl's jaw tightened. "You're threatening me." "No," Marcus replied. "I'm giving you an opportunity to fix your mistake before it defines the rest of your life." A woman stepped forward from the crowd, a firefighter named Elena Vargas, her uniform crisp despite the long ride from Lexington. She held up her phone, the screen glowing in the fading light. "I've already started recording," Elena said. "This footage goes live in 10 minutes unless we see some changes." Carl looked around, searching for support, but the neighbors who had gathered to watch were now nodding in agreement. Even his own movers had stepped back, distancing themselves. Margaret Kinsley, the elderly woman who had made the call, walked slowly toward Carl. Despite her age, her voice carried strength. "I've lived in this building for 23 years, Margaret said. "I've watched you treat good people like garbage. You raised rents on veterans. You ignored maintenance requests from single mothers. You smiled while families struggled. Tonight, it ends." Carl's shoulders sagged. He glanced at Sarah, who stood holding Emma, her eyes red but defiant. He saw something in her expression that made him look away. Not anger, but dignity. The kind of dignity that can't be taken, only surrendered. "Fine," Carl muttered. "The eviction is reversed. She can stay." "Not good enough," Marcus said. "First month's rent is waived. You'll personally apologize, and you'll put it in writing." Carl's face twisted. That's fair," interrupted a voice from the crowd. A man in his 60s stepped forward, wearing a leather vest marked with military insignia. His name was Thomas Grant, chainsaw to those who knew him, and he'd served 3 tours in Vietnam. "I know people in the housing authority," Thomas continued. "I also know people in code enforcement. I'm guessing this building has a few violations you've been ignoring. Want me to make some calls? Carl's face went pale. No, no calls. Then we have an agreement, Marcus said. He turned to Sarah. Get your daughter inside. We'll help you move everything back. The next 2 hours unfolded like a scene from a film Sarah had never thought she'd be part of. The 120 riders, these strangers who had become an army for her, moved with silent efficiency, carrying furniture back up the narrow staircase, reassembling the crib, arranging boxes in the small apartment. No one asked for thanks. No one expected recognition. They simply worked. Their movements synchronized through some unspoken understanding. Jackson Priest Cole carried the kitchen table himself, refusing help despite his age. Your husband and I shared a meal on a table just like this in Baghdad, he said as he set it down. Seemed right that I should be the one to bring it back. Elena Vargas organized the women in the group, setting up Emma's nursery with practiced precision. She'd been a nurse before becoming a firefighter, and her hands moved with the certainty of someone who'd cared for countless children. You're not alone anymore, Elena told Sarah as they folded blankets together. This is what family does. Marcus stood near the window, watching Carl Dreyfus sign the revised rental agreement with trembling hands. Victor Nomad Reyes, a lawyer by day, a biker by choice, reviewed every line, making sure there were no loopholes, no hidden clauses. It's solid, Victor confirmed. She's protected. Carl handed the papers to Sarah without meeting her eyes. I'm sorry, he said, the words forced but audible. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She looked at Emma, who was now awake and reaching for the stuffed rabbit someone had retrieved from a box. She thought about Daniel, about the man who'd promised to protect them, who'd given his life believing that promise would outlive him. My husband believed in second chances, Sarah finally said, so I'll give you one. But if you ever treat another family the way you treated us, these people will know, and they'll be back. Carl nodded quickly and left, his footsteps echoing down the staircase. By 9 o'clock, the apartment was restored. The furniture was in place, the boxes were unpacked, and Emma was asleep in her crib, the stuffed rabbit tucked beside her. Sarah stood in the kitchen, staring at the table where Daniel used to sit, reading the newspaper while she made coffee. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his leather jacket dusted with the day's wear. It's done, he said quietly. Sarah turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. I don't know how to thank you, she said. You don't have to, Marcus replied. Daniel saved my life in Fallujah. He threw himself on top of me when an IED went off, took shrapnel meant for me. I made him a promise that night while the medics were working on him. I told him if anything ever happened to him, I'd take care of his family. He squeezed my hand and said, I know you will, brother. Marcus paused, his voice thick with emotion. That promise didn't die with him. It's still alive, and it always will be. Sarah stepped forward and hugged him, something she hadn't been able to do at the funeral when grief had wrapped around her like chains. Now, surrounded by the evidence of 120 people who had ridden through the night for her, she finally felt what Daniel had tried to tell her in his letters, that she would never truly be alone. If this story is reaching you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more stories of loyalty and courage. Outside, the motorcycles began to start up again, their engines rumbling in the night. One by one, the riders departed, waving to Sarah through the window. Some left envelopes on the kitchen counter, cash, gift cards, offers of employment, phone numbers with notes that read, "Call if you need anything." Jackson Priest Cole was the last to leave. He handed Sarah a worn photograph, the same one Margaret had found, showing 6 men in desert camouflage. "Keep this," Jackson said. "So your daughter knows what kind of man her father was, and so she knows that his brothers will always be here." Sarah looked at the photograph, at Daniel's young face, at Marcus standing beside him, at the 4 other men whose names she'd never learned, but who had probably been among the riders tonight. "Thank you," she whispered. Jackson nodded and walked out, his boots echoing down the staircase one final time. The sun rose over Ashford the next morning, painting the streets in gold. Sarah woke to the sound of Emma babbling in her crib, the stuffed rabbit clutched in her tiny hands. For the first time in months, Sarah didn't wake with dread. She woke with something she'd thought was lost: hope. She walked to the kitchen and found a note on the table, written in Marcus's rough handwriting. "Sarah, your husband was my brother. That makes you family. If you ever need anything, work, help, or just someone to talk to, call me. The number's on the back. You're not walking this road alone. Marcus." Sarah turned the note over and saw a phone number, along with a list of contacts: job opportunities, childcare services, veteran support groups. Marcus had spent the night making calls, ensuring she had a path forward. She looked out the window at the quiet street below. The motorcycles were gone, but their presence lingered like a promise written in the air. She thought about Daniel, about the man who'd believed in loyalty and sacrifice, who'd built a brotherhood that outlived him. Emma started crying, and Sarah picked her up, holding her close. "Your daddy was a hero," Sarah whispered. "And last night, you met his family." 3 months later, Sarah stood in the parking lot of a veterans community center in Louisville, Emma on her hip. Marcus had called her the week before, inviting her to a gathering, a memorial ride for fallen soldiers. She'd been nervous, uncertain if she belonged, but when she arrived, she saw them: Jackson, Elena, Thomas, Victor, Margaret, who'd made the original call, and dozens of others she didn't recognize but who smiled at her like old friends. Marcus walked over, his face weathered but kind. "You came," he said. "I had to," Sarah replied. "I needed to see them again, to thank them." "They'll be glad you're here," Marcus said. He gestured to a banner hanging on the wall, a memorial listing names of fallen soldiers. Daniel Miller's name was there, along with a photograph Sarah had provided. Emma reached out toward the banner, her small hand opening and closing. "She'll know," Marcus said softly. "When she's older, you'll tell her about tonight, about the 120 people who rode through the night because her father's promise was still alive. And she'll understand that family isn't just blood, it's the people who show up when you need them most." Sarah looked at the crowd gathering around the motorcycles, their leather vests gleaming in the fading light. She thought about the night 3 months ago when her world had collapsed, and how these strangers had rebuilt it with their hands and their loyalty. "Daniel would be proud," she said. "He is," Marcus replied. "Wherever he is, he's watching, and he knows his family is safe." The motorcycles started up, their engines roaring like thunder. Sarah stood beside Marcus as they rolled out, a convoy of steel and fire and unbreakable promises. Emma clapped her hands, laughing at the sound. And in that moment, Sarah understood something Daniel had tried to tell her in his last letter, the one she'd read 100 times but hadn't fully understood until now. "If I don't make it home, don't be afraid. My brothers will take care of you. They'll keep my promise alive." Because that's what family does. They show up when it matters most, and they never leave you behind. The motorcycles disappeared into the distance, their taillights fading like stars. But Sarah knew they were out there, riding the highways and back roads, waiting for the next call, the next promise, the next family that needed them. Because some bonds are forged in fire, and some promises never die. Thank you for watching this story of loyalty, courage, and unbreakable promises. If it moved you, please subscribe to see more stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And remember, in a world that often feels cold and indifferent, there are still people who will ride through the night for you. You're never as alone as you think. The morning air in Ashford carried the scent of fresh coffee and autumn leaves as Sarah Miller stepped out of her car in front of the community center. Emma, now 5.5 years old, bounced excitedly in her booster seat, her dark hair tied back in pigtails, her father's eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Is Uncle Marcus going to be there?" Emma asked for the 3rd time that morning. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said, smiling as she unbuckled her daughter. "And Uncle Jackson, and Aunt Elena, and a lot of other people who love you very much." The community center had been transformed. Banners hung across the entrance reading, Iron Promise Foundation, 5-year anniversary. What had started as a single act of loyalty on a quiet street had grown into something larger than anyone had imagined. Sarah walked through the doors holding Emma's hand, and immediately the familiar faces surrounded them. Jackson Priest Cole, now in his 60s but still riding every weekend, knelt down to Emma's level. "There's my favorite little biker," Jackson said, producing a small toy motorcycle from his pocket. "This one's just like your daddy's." Emma squealed with delight and threw her arms around Jackson's neck. Sarah watched, her heart full, remembering the terrified woman she'd been 5 years ago, sitting on a curb with nowhere to go, no hope left. Marcus appeared from the crowd, his greying hair now fully silver, his leather vest adorned with new patches commemorating rides and missions. Behind him walked a young woman Sarah didn't recognize, maybe 19 or 20, holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. "Sarah," Marcus said warmly, embracing her, "I want you to meet someone. This is Jessica Torres. 3 weeks ago, she was facing eviction from her apartment in Lexington. Her husband was killed in a training accident at Fort Campbell 6 months ago." Sarah's breath caught. She looked at Jessica and saw herself, the exhaustion, the fear, the weight of carrying a child alone through a world that felt impossibly cruel. "We rode for her," Marcus continued quietly. 87 of us. Same script, different street. And when we were there, I told her about you, about Daniel, about the night that started all of this." Jessica stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "He said you might be able to help me understand," she said softly. "Help me believe that things can get better." Sarah felt something break open inside her chest, not pain, but purpose. She reached out and took Jessica's hand. "They can," Sarah said, "and they will, but you won't do it alone." Elena Vargas appeared beside them, now the director of the Iron Promise Foundation, a non-profit organization that had been born from that single night 5 years ago. What had started as 120 people showing up for one widow had evolved into a network spanning 14 states. Veterans, first responders, nurses, teachers, and everyday citizens who understood that loyalty wasn't a word, it was an action. "We've helped 43 families this year," Elena explained as she guided them through the center. "Evictions reversed, medical bills paid, job placement secured. And it all traces back to that night in October when we showed up for you." Sarah looked around the room. The walls were covered with photographs, families standing in front of homes they'd been able to keep, children holding diplomas from schools they'd been able to finish, veterans receiving keys to motorcycles donated by the community. And in the center, a large portrait of Daniel Miller in his military uniform, his smile frozen in time. Beneath the portrait, a bronze plaque read, "In memory of Corporal Daniel Miller, whose sacrifice inspired a brotherhood that refuses to let his family, or any family, stand alone. His promise lives on in every mile we ride, every hand we extend, every life we help rebuild." Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Is that Daddy?" "Yes, baby," Sarah said, kneeling down. "That's your daddy, and all these people are here because of him." "Because he was brave?" Emma asked. "Because he loved us," Sarah replied, "and because his friends loved him enough to keep his promise alive." The ceremony began an hour later in the main hall. Thomas Chainsaw Grant, now serving as the Foundation's treasurer, stood at the podium and recounted the story of that October night. How a single phone call had set 120 motorcycles in motion, how a community had been built not from obligation, but from choice. "We ride for the fallen," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his age. "But we also ride for the living, for the widows and the children, the forgotten and the abandoned. We ride because someone once told us that loyalty means showing up, not when it's convenient, but when it matters most." The crowd erupted in applause. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of gratitude, of belonging, of understanding that Daniel's death hadn't been the end of his story. It had been the beginning of something greater. Marcus took the podium next. He looked directly at Sarah as he spoke. 5 years ago, I received a phone call from a woman named Margaret Kinsley, Marcus said. She told me that Sarah Miller, the widow of my brother Daniel, was being thrown into the street with her infant daughter. I didn't hesitate. None of us did, because Daniel had saved my life in Fallujah, and I'd made him a promise. Marcus paused, his voice thick with emotion. But what I didn't understand then was that keeping that promise would change all of us. It reminded us why we serve, why we sacrifice, why we refuse to let the darkness win. Sarah and Emma didn't just receive help that night. They gave us purpose. They reminded us that we're not just veterans or firefighters or nurses. We're guardians, and our watch doesn't end when we take off the uniform. The room fell silent. Marcus looked around at the faces gathered, men and women who had ridden through rain and heat, who had shown up for strangers in distant towns, who had chosen to be part of something larger than themselves. So today, we're not just celebrating 5 years of the Iron Promise Foundation, Marcus continued. We're celebrating the legacy of every person who believes that loyalty is eternal, that promises don't expire, that family is chosen, not given, and that no one, no widow, no child, no veteran, should ever have to face the darkness alone. The crowd rose to their feet, applause echoing through the hall. Sarah felt Emma squeeze her hand. "Mommy, why is everyone clapping?" Emma asked. "Because they're happy, sweetheart," Sarah said, "because good people still exist." After the ceremony, Sarah found herself standing outside in the parking lot as the sun began to set. The motorcycles were lined up in perfect rows, over 200 of them now, gleaming under the golden light. She thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, broken and terrified, convinced the world had abandoned her. Marcus walked up beside her, his hands in his pockets. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "We all have," Sarah replied. She looked at him. "I have something to tell you. I've been accepted into nursing school, full scholarship through a veterans family program. I start in January." Marcus's face broke into a rare smile. "Daniel would be proud." "I hope so," Sarah said. "I want Emma to grow up knowing that even when life knocks you down, you can get back up, that there are people who will help you stand, and that the greatest thing you can do is become one of those people for someone else." "You already are," Marcus said. "Jessica Torres told me you've been calling her every day, helping her navigate the housing paperwork, connecting her with childcare resources. You're paying it forward." Sarah nodded. "Because someone did it for me, and now it's my turn." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as riders began mounting their motorcycles, preparing for the memorial ride that would close the evening. Emma ran up, clutching her toy motorcycle, her face glowing with joy. "Uncle Marcus!" she shouted. "Can I ride on your bike?" Marcus laughed and scooped her up. "Not yet, little one. But when you're older, I'll teach you myself, just like I promised your daddy I would." Emma wrapped her arms around his neck. "Will you tell me stories about him?" "Every single one," Marcus said. "So you'll know what kind of man he was, and what kind of woman your mother is." As the motorcycles roared to life and rolled out into the sunset, Sarah stood with Emma in her arms, watching the convoy disappear down the highway. The sound of their engines faded slowly, like a promise being carried into the distance. Margaret Kinsley, now 82 and using a cane, walked up beside Sarah. "I'm glad I made that call," Margaret said softly. "So am I," Sarah replied. "You saved us." "No, dear," Margaret said, shaking her head. "I just dialed a number. Marcus and his brothers saved you, and now you're saving others. That's how it works. That's how love survives." Sarah looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, the toy motorcycle still clutched in her small hand. She thought about Daniel, about the man who had believed in brotherhood and sacrifice, who had given his life believing that his family would be protected. And they had been. not by institutions or systems, but by people, flawed, scarred, ordinary people who had chosen to be extraordinary when it mattered most. "Thank you, Daniel," Sarah whispered into the fading light. "Your promise is still alive, and it always will be." The last motorcycle disappeared over the horizon, its taillight flickering like a distant star. And Sarah stood there, no longer alone, no longer afraid, surrounded by a family she hadn't been born into but had been chosen by. Because some promises are stronger than death, and some families are built not from blood, but from loyalty that refuses to break.